the whole world wants to invest in our financial services, our financial assets. And I think and Trump wants that. So I think they're not factoring that in when they focus so much on the trade deficit.
Global stock markets plummeted before Donald Trump announced a new swathe of tariffs. They've continued to fall since. The dollar has reached its lowest level of the year so far, and the air is thick with a slew of forecasts in which US inflation rises, growth slows, and unemployment increases. Ditto for the global economy. Andrew Hale is a senior trade policy analyst at the American think tank, the Heritage Foundation. He joins me again now. Andrew, good to have you back. How much more
Yes,
likely?
and thank you so much for having me back. I just want to make one clarification. I'm not an author of the Project 2025 book, Mandate for Leadership. Indeed,
Oh
the
no,
Heritage
we didn't say
Foundation
so either. I haven't attached you to Project 2025 in any way.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm happy to clarify that. So let me ask you this: how much more likely is a U.S. recession, or at least a serious slowdown, now compared with only 24 hours ago?
Well, for example, it's highly likely if these are maintained, if they're maintained, we will get a recession, likely high inflation, major victories for the Democrats in the midterms in 2026 and even potentially 2028. Interesting conservative warfare, and it will, of course, keep all goods prices potentially quite high. That's if they're maintained. I have to say the thing that struck me mostly about yesterday was I was looking at the data as they held up the placard when Howard Lutnick brought that to President Trump, and I thought, wait a minute, why do they have the same percentage for a country like Switzerland, which is so free trade, as well as with a country like Brazil, which is so protectionist? And then I realized they didn't actually calculate tariff rates and non-tariff barriers as they said they did. Instead, for every country, they just took our trade deficit with that country and divided it by the country's exports to us. That's a very different calculation than say what we were told they were doing, actually. So I'm afraid I would actually argue that their maths are flawed.
Yeah, well, the result is that poor little Lesotho in Africa gets a 50% tariff by doing it that way, which does seem rather ridiculous. I suppose, though, the risk of a recession is even greater if there is now widespread retaliation.
Indeed, indeed, and of course, I was just talking yesterday to a major manufacturer here in the United States, and they manufacture most of their stuff here in the United States, so they're not terribly concerned about the tariffs in the terms that we are with regards to imports to the United States. They're concerned about exports and the retaliatory tariffs that's coming at them. I've had a lot of companies call me up already. One company in Ohio told me that SME employs 300 people. They've already had to lay off a third of their workforce, and that's someone who, of course, the CEO of that company sits on the Republican Committee of Ohio, was a huge backer of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. So I think this has a huge effect, not just in the economy, but also the potential midterms if these are not, pulled back at some point before the midterms.
Do you expect countries now to rush to cut their own tariffs in the hope that Mr. Trump will then cut his new reciprocal tariffs? As word this morning that Vietnam may do that. Isn't there a problem, though? Because if a lot of countries do that, then all the money Mr. Trump says he's going to get for tariffs wouldn't materialize. I mean, you can't reduce the reciprocal tariffs and still regard tariffs as a revenue generator.
I entirely agree. And of course, some people who are defending these are saying that the U.S. couldn't negotiate trade deals because everyone already had good access to the U.S. market, and now they don't. And so Trump just gave himself a lot of bargaining chips. That's one way to look at it. But of course, you have seen how Israel has just announced before these tariffs were announced yesterday that they were, of course, removing all their tariffs against U.S. goods. Of course, they didn't really have many tariffs against U.S. goods. That's pretty easy for them to do. But they, of course, came out first to do that. And I think if you read the executive order that President Trump issued yesterday and read it, they do say, if countries do reduce their barriers, then that's how they can have some relief of this. But I think some of the premise is very difficult because, of course, I don't agree with them with regards to their focus on the trade deficits, because that's a flip side for the demand of our assets. Instead of exchanging exported goods for imported goods, we make financial assets here in the United States, And, we all seek foreign investment, as does President Trump, yet some deride the trade deficits. So, for example, if you have, for example, a capital account surplus, you must have an equal and opposite sign current account deficit. And most of the current account is in trade and goods and services. So again, the whole world wants to invest in our financial services, our financial assets. And I think and Trump wants that. So I think they're not factoring that in when they focus so much on the trade deficit.
You've implied in this interview a couple of times that maybe these tariffs aren't forever, that maybe they're just part of deals that Mr. Trump wants to make. And I understand that. There is a lot of uncertainty around. But if that uncertainty is widespread, why would you as a company relocate to America because there's a high tariff against your stuff coming in from the outside? You suddenly invest, what, 100 million in Alabama, only to find out that a couple of months later, Mr. Trump's taken the tariff away.
Not only that, I agree with you entirely on that, as well as yesterday he had all these trade union workers, Teamsters, et cetera, right there at the White House Rose Garden. So if he takes away these tariffs, those are the people who basically want these tariffs to be maintained. I mean, that's an interesting aspect there. He doesn't have to get reelected again, obviously, but his successor will want to get reelected, and he's got a constituency there of the American, trade union movement and workers, and of course they used to all be Democrats, and they could easily go back to the Democrat Party as well. And to follow on for your question about confidence, I mean, I've had so many CEOs of major corporations, even just SMEs, as well as major bankers, call me up and say, where is this going to land? We need to make plans. We need to plan our investments. We have to plan our business projects, and people can't do it. And I think at least yesterday, we were hoping that we'd have some sort of playbook on how this was going to go forward. And I'm afraid that there's still a lot of uncertainty, and the markets don't like that.
And it's that uncertainty that's making people reluctant to invest and therefore increases the chances of a slowdown in the American economy. Can you clarify one thing for us, Andrew, that this 10% minimum, Mr. Trump has put a 10% tariff on almost everything coming into the United States. He seems to regard that as a minimum. Now, the British are on the 10% one. They kind of imply that they could do a trade deal and maybe do even better than that. But I was getting the impression from the administration last night that 10% is a minimum, and that's not a negotiable 10%. That stays wherever other deals are done. Can you shed any light on that?
Yes, I've heard that as well, Andrew. But the problem is that, the goalposts keep shifting. And of course, there's so many disparate groups in the White House and in other government departments who are all jockeying for the president's attention. And of course, there's, shall we say, some conflict as well, as there always is. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation about the role of certain individuals. And of course, I know that even the day before yesterday, they actually had a number of reports sent up to the White House with different plans for this. And I've been told that they're not going to release those reports, which were due on Tuesday. And of course, maybe they might release the executive summary. So we won't actually know, but they basically must have looked at all of those and came up with this plan. But there are other people, of course, who had produced other plans, and those were obviously not included. So again, there are multiple factions competing for the president's attention, and some concerned about the level in which Howard Lutnick has such an impact upon President Trump and his current policies. And of course, I think what was very revealing was there was an element of a clown show in some of the detail yesterday, because of course there's the Harold and McDonald Islands, which were on there. And I looked at some of this stuff and I thought, wait a minute, they just have penguins living there, and they're uninhabited. What was that? And then of course the British Indian Ocean Territory was in that. That's of course a U.S. base that's leased from the British, and most people there are American servicemen, and most of the stuff there is flown in and put in an American commissary there. So I couldn't understand that 10% on that. And I think whoever drew up that list is quite pedestrian, and they need to take a very, very basic remedial course in world geography.
Well, maybe the algorithm didn't quite work. Very important, I think, we have tariffs against territories in which no one lives. That's clearly an important
Clearly,
part.
The penguins need to be tariffed.
Yes, exactly. Tariff the penguins, I say. Andrew, if this 10% minimum is non-negotiable, if these reciprocal tariffs that Mr. Trump's announced largely stay, they can be negotiated at the edges, and if China and the European Union retaliate, along with some others, maybe Japan too, would what was announced yesterday mark the end of free trade, the free trade global system as we have known it?
Yes, it's the largest increase in tariff protection in the United States in 150 years. So yes, and of course, if they're maintained, we will get a recession, no question about it. The question is, will they be maintained? Because President Trump is mindful of the midterms. Also, we had a very interesting bill that passed yesterday in Congress with some defectors from the Republican side with regards to a bill that would remove the tariffs against Canada under IEPA. And that's another thing. What President Trump relied upon, Andrew, yesterday is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. He relied upon that again. He is using this is illegal. He's pressing the limits of presidential power. This act was given to the president in 1977 with no intention by Congress that this would ever be used for tariffs, as well as the word tariff does not appear in the legislation, and it's unprecedented. And a judge will look at this and say, there is no genuine emergency here, that you have to have a genuine emergency under IEPA, and the tariff is not the tool in which you can use. The question is, why has this not been brought before a federal judge yet? And the reason for that is people are frightened. Trade associations, CEOs of companies, etc., are frightened of the retaliation from President Trump and his administration if they cross him, because we've seen how, for example, they have a tendency to blow back against those who try to take them to the courts over some of their actions, which are indeed illegal.
Andrew, thank you for that. Thank you again. Andrew Hale, Senior Trade Policy Analyst at the American think tank, the Heritage Foundation.